So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about transgender experience and, by necessity, mine specifically, but with the real goal of thinking about how we can sort of use this as a way, as a means of helping transgender students. Of thinking, I really want this to be something that I'm hoping that you get a lot out of, not just sort of an increased perspective on what it means to be transgender and what transgender experience is, but also like how you can use this to support the people around you who really, really need support. And in a way that's a little bit tricky for me to like try to take my experience and apply it broadly, because the first thing to really know is that, like almost any marginalized population you might talk about, no two transgender people's stories are exactly alike. And so I feel like I need to start by talking a little bit about specifically where I'm coming from before I try to broaden that out into advice that you can use. And one of the first things maybe that I think is significant about my experience would be how it differs from a lot of the students that you have coming in right now, which is that I was born almost 40 years ago in 1984. And what that means and why it's relevant is that I'm a person who, anybody who was born like in that first half of that decade, was born on certain cultural cusps, like on the edge of certain cultural moments of shifts and changes. Like anyone born around that time knows that we had sort of an analog childhood and a digital adulthood. That we grew up in Stranger Things times, and now we're adults, like in a cyberpunk era. But what it also means for trans people who were born around the same time I was, is that I was born before the big transgender revolution that took place in the early, I would say the early 2010s. Like if you've been paying attention at all to media in the last decade, you realize that transgender celebrities have sort of exploded across the screen. Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine in like 2012 or 2013 with a subheading that read something like "The Transgender Tipping Point," which sort of meant that this was a time period where suddenly transgender people who, when I was growing up, were basically only seen as murder victims on Law and Order, or people to be shocked and disgusted by on Jerry Springer, now are like guests of honor as opposed to guests of disdain, I guess you could say. And where transgender lives and transgender stories started coming into the spotlight, and more people started understanding what it meant to be transgender. I grew up in a time before all of that, and I transitioned about a decade before all of that, at a time when people sort of, at best, needed to have the concept of being transgender, or we were still using the word transsexual back then, explained to them as far as the basics of what that means. And frequently, almost every coming out conversation that I had was both a teaching session and frequently an argument with people who weren't really sure whether they believed that transgender was a real thing, or that it was, not just a sexual fetish, or that it was different from drag in some way. And I feel lucky that we made it through that, and I feel like we've seen a lot of great changes in a general level of cultural awareness over the last 10 years. I still wonder when I'm at an event like this if I need to bring up like and sort of define certain terms before going forward. So like to get at real basics, I'm going to start by asking you guys like a couple of questions. When I say a word like transgender, if I talk about transition, are these things that is anyone willing to say that like you need some of these basics defined for you, just in terms of what these words mean before we get into particulars of experience?
I think it would be helpful for
Fair
us
enough.
to hear to hear it.
Some basic fair enough. And I guess I'm going to jump into I'm going to pull back out of this. There's a presentation that I've given to like various college groups that sometimes I use these few definition slides and sometimes I don't, but I'm going to. So in a few minutes I'll come back to this, but for the moment, just to get some basic terminology out of the way, the word transgender is kind of an umbrella term. It's used to identify anybody whose gender identity, that is like how we self-identify, how we see ourselves, how we socially and psychologically identify, is different from the gender that they were assigned at birth based on their sex, and that, or sometimes I guess before birth. And so it basically is simply a way of identifying those of us who, or a way of, defining those of us who identify in one way or another as different from the gender that we were assigned at birth. When the doctor, slaps your little baby butt on and says, it's a boy or it's a girl. If you are someone who, the doctor said it's a boy, and then you grew up and went, yeah, that was about right, then you would be a cisgender person. You're not transgender. Whereas if you were someone who, the doctor said it's a girl, and then you grew up and didn't really feel like that was accurate, and you have a different sense of yourself, then you would fall under the umbrella that we use the word transgender for. Now, it's important you'll hear me use the words gender and sex a bit, and it's important to kind of understand the distinction there between gender identity and sex, because really when the sonogram's getting read, or at worst, or at latest at birth, when someone's saying it's a boy or it's a girl, what they're really doing is basing that determination on physical sex, on biological sex. So that means body type. So like, sex refers to, your primary sexual characteristics of your genitals. It also refers to, all of your secondary sexual characteristics. Whereas gender or gender identity refers to your social and psychological sense of self. So it is how you see yourself, and it's how you live in the world. And so gender is something that is cultural, that is social, that is psychological, whereas sex is something that is physical. Anybody with me so far? Interrupt me with questions. I don't mind being interrupted, by the way. That's perfectly fine. Now, the thing that you'll hear me talk a lot about, because it's kind of a defining experience for those of us who are transgender, is transition. And this is a period of time in which a transgender person sort of makes various changes, some, although not necessarily all, of like social changes, legal changes, medical changes, to kind of better align their life to their identity. It's where, it involves this entire process of coming out and sort of self-transformation and development in order to be the person that you want to see in the mirror. Now, yeah, I've already kind of said this. Please feel free to ask me questions along the way. Now, under this umbrella, and why we use the term transgender as kind of a inclusive term, is that this includes a lot of different kinds of people. It includes people like me who are who have made kind of simply a direct transition between, growing up as a boy and living as a man, and then transitioning to female, and so identifying and living as a woman, and people who, transition in the opposite direction from female to male. It also includes under the umbrella people who don't necessarily identify with a specific gender, people who are people who might use a term like agender or genderqueer or non-binary. Also includes people who identify as gender fluid. Gender fluid meaning that maybe one day you feel more and identify more with manhood, another day with womanhood. A person who feels like their sense of gender identity is more in flux and not necessarily fixed. And
would this also include the word androgynous?
Well, possibly. So in terms of the word androgynous would kind of fit, would generally be kind of referring to gender expression and how we express our genders. Because we can kind of separate a little bit the gender that we identify with the degree of masculinity or femininity that we might express. We all know men who, who identify as men and yet are more feminine people, and we all know women who identify as women but are simply more butch or masculine people, and so your gender expression, like the degree of masculinity or femininity that you may feel comfortable presenting, I would probably use the word androgynous to kind of describe someone who whose expression was androgynous, although I could definitely see a person may certainly consider their identity to be androgynous as well. Simply, somewhere in between, or something outside of that typical binary spectrum. But basically anyone who, the umbrella term kind of covers anyone who is not satisfied with that sort of initial assignment of, it's a boy, it will grow up to be a man, or it's a girl, it will grow up to be a woman. Basically, any other identity will fit under this umbrella in one way, shape, or form. Does that make sense? Or did that answer your question I should ask? I'm sorry. Cool. All right. So this, I think that probably, as far as, so I talked about how transition is this kind of key and defining experience for people. And transition can mean a lot of different things. What it frequently means is that someone will make certain social changes or changes to their appearance and possibly changes to their name and asking to be referred to in a different way, by different pronouns, by a different name. Almost always some kind of change in gender expression. Like if you are going through transition, you're probably changing what you express about yourself in some way. It's kind of significant to know because this used to be an assumption that people would make was that, and would sort of hyper focus on even, was that transition would necessarily mean medical treatment. The transition would necessarily mean hormone therapy and surgery. For some people it does, for me it did, but it doesn't necessarily for everyone. Transition means changes, but it doesn't necessarily mean any specific changes. Like there's all kinds of changes a person might undergo when transitioning, but none of those specific changes are requisite. Like a person may, I can envision a person who may simply desire to go by a different name and pronouns without necessarily changing even much about their expression. There are certainly trans people who don't feel the need for medical treatment and plenty of others who do. There are people who will go for psychiatric treatment and for counseling and others who won't. There are people who will make legal changes to their legal gender or their legal name and others who won't. And so basically transition is a very individual and a very personal thing. And, there was for quite some time a sort of standardized path of transition, but that's one thing that's changed a lot in the last 10 or 20 years, is that we've started to recognize that not every trans person's path is the same. So these are things does this kind of cover, I think this covers a lot of the sort of basics that you'll need. But before I duck out of the PowerPoint and go back to just sort of talking about my specific story and then getting to how we can apply this, are there any words, so you brought up, I think that was Lynn, brought up the word androgynous. Are there any other, words or terms or burning questions that you had about the basics that you've felt like you've just been embarrassed to ask, like you've heard it so many times and you just are not sure how to ask it anymore? Is there anything that you want to get out of the way now?
I think it was very helpful to think about expression versus identity versus kind of biology, etc. Those distinctions are really helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is too. And it's one of the big things that we spend a lot of time in our gender studies classes going over, is just sort of picking apart all the things that we've sort of wrapped together in our culture. Like for so long, we wrapped together biology and expression and identity and sexual orientation really kind of all up into one, into this assumption that really there's there are two kinds of people. There's there's the person born with a penis who will grow up to play sports and drink beer and have sex with women, and then there are people who are born with vaginas and will grow up to wear dresses and cry at Pixar movies and have sex with men. And these are our two categories. And what we've slowly, I think, been in a cultural process of doing is understanding that really we're looking at multiple different aspects of who a person is and what a person does, and realizing that these things don't all have to fit into two boxes, that there are a lot of different ways to be and a lot of variations in how we express ourselves and in how we identify. And so, yeah, I do think I'm glad that you find it a little useful to kind of peel that apart a little bit. Now, in terms of, to kind of pop out of the PowerPoint for a minute, in terms of talking about my particular story, my particular experience, I guess the truth is, I've talked about how for a while there was a really typical transgender narrative that we were expected to follow. You were either transitioning from male to female or from female to male, and with an expectation that you would be a very typical woman or a very typical man, when transition was done with. Without knowing it, in a lot of ways, I played out that story even before I knew what it was, like what the expectation was for a trans person. In that, and I'm sorry, I may drink a lot of water. My throat is a little bit sore from this week. In that, I was someone who knew what I was from a very young age. Like some of my earliest memories were realizing that the people around me identified me as a boy and grouped me as a boy, and knowing that that wasn't right and that that wasn't accurate. Like some of the earliest memories I have were realizing that I've been basically put in the wrong place. Like realizing that there were things expected of me that that I didn't think that I could do or didn't want to do, and realizing that people saw me in a way that I didn't see myself. You know, back when as a kid, I still, had a religious mindset and was being raised in a religion. I used to, sort of pray to God to wake up and be changed. And as early as I realized that there was some way that I had been misidentified, just about that early, I realized that this feeling that I was having was something that was wrong, was something that I couldn't let people know about. Because as far as I knew at that time, which kind of goes along with being, again, before this trans revolution and definitely before the internet, back in Stranger Things times, I assumed that there were no other trans people. Like I didn't have language for this yet. And these were things, I simply assumed that I was the only person who felt this way. Before the internet, there really was no way to know. Before media exposure, there was really no way to know. And it was only, it took until young adulthood, it took until, my high school years really, in order to start sort of learning that I wasn't alone. And this is one way in which, generation really matters here. Like where I like to talk about trans experience in terms of when you were born, because it has a huge effect on things. Like these days, today, you are more likely, and trans people are more likely to realize not only what they are, but also that there are other people like them at a much earlier age. And whereas people who are older than me, it wasn't uncommon for trans people who, are now in their 60s and 70s, they might have been 30 or 40 by the time they came to realize and accept and vocalize, who they were. I know 60 and 70-year-old women who transitioned in the last few years, but it took that long because until then they didn't really have models to follow. They didn't have a sense that there was a culture out there for them. And so in previous generations, this might have taken me until I was 40 or 50 years old to kind of understand and express who and what I am. For me, it did take me still a bit, even after realizing that there were other people like me. Even after realizing that there were other trans people in the world, I was still in a time period and in a culture where even knowing what I was, I had a strong sense that I could not share this with people. I had a belief for quite some time that despite knowing who I was and what I wanted, I believed that I would lose too much by transitioning. And I carried that belief with me well into going into college and into my first career when I started out teaching high school, and then I taught 8th grade for a few years. And in those years, which was, I guess we're talking around 2000, 2006, 2007 at this point. So we're 5 years before the big trans revolution. It's kind of shocking how much has changed in a short period of time. But basically, at that point in time, I was in what I recognize now as a slow process of transition. I started coming out to people around the age of 20, and I felt this enormous relief in beginning to express who I was in different situations with different groups of people. With some friends, I would present as a woman. With other friends, I would present as a man. With with romantic partners, it depended on the partner. With work, I went in presenting as a man. With family, I would present as a man, but with most of my friends, I would present as a woman. Basically, I call this stretch of time the phone booth years for me, even though phone booths were kind of gone by then. Just in that it felt a little bit like a kind of Superman into the nearest phone booth thing. I had a habit of when I was still living with my parents before I had graduated college, I would keep a trunk full of clothes, and I was ready to transform my entire appearance in back alleys and in gas station bathrooms. And then once I had my own place, when I was teaching and actually had a job, I kept 2 closets, one full of one wardrobe and one full of another wardrobe. And so it was kind of and I would be changing on the fly all the time. In different situations, I would be a different person. And so I guess it's actually a little bit more like a kind of Clark Kent into the phone booth and Wonder Woman coming out, but you get the general idea. It was a sense that that I had to be two different people in two different situations, which is very, very exhausting. And a lot of trans people, particularly of my generation, have had that experience of needing to be, or I don't know about quite precisely that, but a sense of needing to be different people in different situations. And what I tried to tell myself for a while was that I tried to find a way to feel like both of these selves were true in some sense, because I still believed during this time that this was as far as I was going to go. That I believed for quite a while that I couldn't fully transition, even though I knew that that was what I wanted. I felt that I couldn't do that because I believed strongly, and in a sense, before this cultural change happened, that might have, in some sense felt true. I believe strongly that I couldn't be a transgender person and a teacher. I felt strongly that I couldn't be a transgender person and have a family. I felt that I couldn't be an out trans woman and have a partner. And so I believe that, if I were to transition, I would lose too much. And so I tried to tell myself for a long time that maybe both of these selves are authentic in their own way, in some sense, but I was very much lying to myself at that point. And the exhaustion of it, like made me ill frequently. I would get sick for long stretches of time just because I was exhausted and stressed in a way that's hard to think back on and look at now. Finally, it was only finally when I was about 25 years old and going back to graduate school, because my school, I was teaching in a very low income school district, and at some point they let go of all the non-tenured teachers, which included me. And so I went back to graduate school, and at this point I was making a lot of changes. I had a separation from a partner, and a lot was going on. And I just decided, if there's ever a time in my life where I'm going to do this, this is it. And so I decided that that I would come out, that I would stop, that I would sort of drop what by then felt like very much a costume. Like I felt like I was wearing a costume whenever I was putting on men's clothes. And so I dropped it and I moved forward. And it felt like an enormous leap. And I honestly, up until the very point that I sat down with my new department chair at NIU, which is where I went to do my master's and my doctorate, I sat down with the department chair in English, who I had only recently met. And I sat down because I was also about to start teaching there as a teaching intern. And I explained these things to her, and I really, up until that moment, a part of me thought, she's going to tell me that I can't teach. Like she's going to tell me that they have to find something else for me to do, or that they won't let me be a teacher. I really believed that. This was 2009 or 2010. But thankfully, that's not what she said, obviously. What she said is, you need to do this as soon as possible. Like you needed to do this right away. And so I did. Like it was a going out and, buying business clothes and making my social transition immediately. And I'm very, very glad I did. From there came all of the other typical stuff. I'm in a lot of ways, I am that kind of typical trans person who did, I went through all the legal changes, which is more complex than you would think. I don't know if any of you realize that you have more than one legal gender, that you have a state gender and you have a federal gender that are marked in different databases. I don't know if a lot of you, if you have ever changed your name for any purpose aside from getting married, you might know that you have to publish your information in a local newspaper for like 3 weeks in a row. There's all kinds of ridiculous things to go through in terms of legal changes. Also going through all of the medical changes that are involved, that are typically involved for transition, which is really like basically going through puberty again at like 26 or 27 years old, because it was just so fun the first time that I thought I would do it again. And and so I went through all these things and ultimately came out the other end, feeling better, feeling stronger. And in a lot of ways, I mean, I know I've said that this is this has been for a long time a typical trans narrative. The truth is that also I was very lucky in a lot of ways. There are a lot of ways I was luckier than many trans people who are around my age, and that, you know, despite my worries and fears, I had a very supportive, you know, faculty surrounding me. I had a great experience at work. My family was more supportive than I expected. You know, my parents were wonderful. Like well, actually, I'm sorry, my mom had passed away before I had the chance to transition. My dad was extremely supportive. He gave me, you know, he helped me choose my new name. He was extremely supportive when I came out to him. He was a beautiful man. But and so in many ways, I had not just a typical, but an ideal situation. But that isn't to say, though, that at the same time that I wasn't still affected for a long time by the degree of concern that I'd had about that I wouldn't be accepted. Like, that's a lingering mindset that lasts for a long time, that can last for a long time, and that affects you. I would say probably most strongly. I also worried that if I were to transition, I knew that for me, my sexual orientation was, you know, was toward other women, and always has been. I mean, at least in terms of relationships, and I believed for a long time that no one would want a relationship with me if I were to transition. And so when you go around believing that, you develop a very low kind of esteem that makes you exactly the kind of person that abusive people target. And my first serious relationship after transition turned out to be a prolonged and really abusive one. And so, you know, I've had my very, very fortunate things that I've experienced, and my very, very unfortunate things. But I think that maybe the most important thing to take out of this is that at the same time that I was going through gender transition, a gender transition is always a story of a lot of other changes that are going on at the same time. A lot of other changes that that you're experiencing in the course of changing gender. Like for me, a transition from male to female was also a transition from sickness to health, really. I mentioned that I used to get sick a lot, and in ways that I did not really connect or understand in relation to gender. But back when I was really living two lives, several times a year I would spend like 3 or 4 weeks, completely laid up, and just a mess, vomiting all the time, and unable to speak because I'd lose my voice, and just a complete physical wreck. And somehow it never occurred to me that this was really unusual. Like, people would try, it's like some people tried to point out that this is strange, that most people don't get sick this way, and I would say, oh, people get sick, I don't know, this is just a thing. I didn't realize until after I transitioned that was why I was getting sick. Like, the first winter that I went through after transition, I prepared myself, developed all kinds of lesson plans to give to substitute people, and set up I bought Kleenex in bulk like I always did, and was all set up, and then didn't get sick. Or at least not I might, I'll get a 24-hour cold like anybody, but I don't get sick the way I used to. It was also a transition from being, as a child, really socially isolated and full of anxiety, to someone who enjoys, talking to groups of people like this and is a really social person. I would have described myself as a kid as very, very introverted and very, very isolated. I saw something wrong with myself, and it made me not want to be around people. It made me feel weird. I felt if people get to know me, they're not going to like me because there's something wrong with me. And it eventually, came out that as an adult, I don't think I am introverted. I think I'm actually a very extroverted person. I just was, severely inhibited by that kind of anxiety that I no longer feel. It took me from being, okay, so you were curious, you asked about the whole circus artist thing. It took me from being an extremely inactive couch potato kind of person to being an acrobat. Basically, when I was little, like a little kid, I was a very physically active kid. I liked running around and climbing trees and jumping on a trampoline, and I rode my bike, and I swam everywhere, and I took gymnastics and martial arts and all this stuff. And then, without really thinking about why, when I was a teenager, it all stopped. I didn't do any of those things. It just sort of cut off. I didn't want to do anything anymore. I sat inside and I read and I played video games, and that was it. And if you had asked me at the time, I don't think I would have been able to really explain to you exactly why I stopped doing all of those things. But in retrospect, in retrospect, it's very natural. It's a simple matter of I didn't trust my body anymore. Like when I became an adolescent, I didn't trust my body to do the things that I once trusted it to do, and I didn't want to climb things. I didn't want to swim. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to do gymnastics. I didn't want to do any of that. It wasn't until I started sort of regaining control of my body when I was in my 20s and I was going through, hormone treatments and eventually surgical treatments, that I started feeling a relationship with my body that I hadn't felt in a long time. And it made me want to do things that I hadn't done before, and that I made me want to be physical again. And so I started running and rock climbing, and then eventually, okay, if you were curious about that part, I'm an aerial circus artist. So let me just really quickly, I'll share screen again. So by circus artist, I mean, I do, specifically, I do aerial silk. So it's where, if you've ever seen, the dangling fabrics, you climb up and do tricks on. Basically, that's the gist of circus arts. I like to, it's just sort of, it started briefly, I guess, for me after I sort of finished my process of medical treatments, and eventually, and I felt like I needed to do something to sort of take back control of my body, and take back, a sense of my body as something that could work and be active. And so for me, what is transition for me? It was a transition to, not just between genders, but between, like, entire lives, like one just infinitely better than the other. And that's, I think, maybe one of the biggest points that I like people to understand when thinking about transgender experience, is that really what transgender experience is about is more than just gender, but it's coming into a sense of self that feels authentic, and that feels true, and that feels comfortable. And it's frequently a transition into simply a better life. Like, it's a story of bettering yourself. Like, since, I knew that I was going to change my gender and it would feel good. At the time, I didn't realize that gender transition would also make me a better teacher. It makes me a better writer. It definitely makes me a better wife and a better mother, because I'm a person now who doesn't feel like I am constantly trying to pretend to be somebody I'm not. And that's, I think, one of the biggest things that I like people to understand when I talk about trans ideas, is simply that you are coming into a point where you are able to be your fullest and best self. And I think the cool thing for you guys, I'm going to kind of cut off talking about myself here, because the cool thing for you guys is that because you are working at you're working at a university, where the entire goal is to help people become better versions of themselves, and that you have students who you can help. The cool thing for you guys, I think, is that you get to be part of that. Even if you're not a transgender person, but you work with transgender people, you help transgender people. And I want to talk a little bit about the different ways that if you are working at a college or university, that transgender experience, or that understanding transgender experience, that understanding transgender people, can help you do your job better, basically. So I'm going to pop back to that PowerPoint for a moment here, and let's talk a little bit more about how you can apply this knowledge and this understanding of trans people. So transgender college students, in many ways, might have some different kinds of stories than I have. If in one kind of important way, they may still be figuring themselves out. And this is one thing I like to talk about, because there's a sort of expectation that comes from cisgender people at times that transgender people will have all the answers. That when a transgender person comes out to you, they're going to have it all figured out, that they know who and what they are completely. Some of us do, like me, from a very early age, but some people don't. And it's okay for a person to simply say, I think I'm going to try this and see how this fits. Some of us know exactly what we are. Some of us need to try on different identities, and it's something to be patient for, especially if you're working with young people, but really even if you're working with older people. It's also important to know that transgender college students, this might sound obvious, but may still be dependent on families and communities who may not be supportive. In other words, like they may have to contend with the fact that they may have to be different people in different situations. They may know precisely who and what they are, and they may know exactly how they want to be referred to by names and by pronouns, but they're still under a mental stress potentially of going back home to a family or a community that doesn't respect that. And so being aware, I guess that's why I talk about the amount of stress that I was feeling when I was trying to live two lives. Be aware that this stress impacts a person, and that stress of an unsupported family or community might have a severe impact on them. It might impact the degree to which they trust people. It might impact the degree to which they feel comfortable expressing themselves. And it also can impact the degree to which they rely on you, that they rely on the people at their university, because you may be the supportive people in their lives when other people are not. They may not be as as well educated as you might like them to be in terms of their own rights or ready to self-advocate for themselves. One of the best things that, like I said, that anybody ever did for me was to be more ready to accept me than I was to accept myself. Well, like I said, when I came out to my department chair at Northern Illinois University, I expected to be told that I couldn't teach. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for the fact that someone was more ready to advocate for me than I was ready to advocate for myself. Like I was ready to, I mean, I don't know what I would have done exactly if she had told me that, but that's what I expected. And so the fact that someone was ready to advocate for me when I wasn't even ready to do so for myself was just a gift that I can't even express in terms of value. Now, in terms of the kind of support that people need, everyone needs respect, everyone needs safety, everyone needs access, and everyone needs the right to identify themselves and to determine how they'll be referred to and how they'll be treated. Now, when I like to put this, I could almost have said, every trans person needs, but really what I mean is everyone needs. Because really I want you to think about, the things that a trans person needs are in many ways the same as what every other student needs. We need to be respected, and that includes respecting our gender identities. We need a sense of safety, a sense of security, a sense that we are, we are accepted within the community of the university. We need access to anything that cisgender people have access to. And this is why, transgender inclusion is really the job of everybody. It's not just a job for professors. It's not just a job for administrators. This is really something that reaches across the entire university, because everything that's at the university is in some way there to serve students. And if it's there to serve students, it needs to be there to serve all students. And so access to safe housing, access to athletics, access to healthcare if your university has like on-campus healthcare. Access is huge. And ultimately, the right to self-determination, like the right to identify oneself and to be respected based on that. Now, in terms of how we do that, I'm going to be sharing with you guys, I'll bounce over in a moment, to a handout from the Consortium of Higher Education that includes best practices for supporting transgender students. And I'm going to try to share this through Zoom, but if it doesn't quite come through, I'll send it by email, and you guys can distribute it sort of amongst yourselves. But it's a really useful PDF that breaks down different areas of college life, and that really stresses the need for attention from a variety of professionals. So let me jump over to that for a moment. So this is a document that can almost be treated like a checklist of where you can kind of go through this and you can investigate for yourselves, and you can ask yourselves, does our college do this? And as you can see, we even have a table of contents for things related to campus records, records and registration, to housing, to, facilities, Greek life, to health and counseling, and including questions like, well, actually, let me skip, because I know we have a lot of people here from facilities, I think. And so if I were to go to recommendations related to campus facilities, things like requiring a gender inclusive restroom for newly constructed buildings, where allowed by legal codes, change single stall men's and women's restrooms into gender inclusive facilities. Things like having an online list or map of gender inclusive restrooms, inclusive bathroom policy. A lot of these relate to bathrooms because we wind up in a lot of arguments over bathrooms, but that's kind of the facilities one. If we were to bounce up to, say, housing, creating a fair and equitable process for hiring and training and maintaining, knowledgeable residential life staff members. Having an easily accessible place on the university's webpage especially in the section for housing that establishes these policies. If you have students filling out their gender, forms that include their gender, make it inclusive. Allow them to self-identify in this way, because many people don't necessarily identify as a woman or a man. And generally speaking, always go with a person's identity and a person's self-identification in terms of how they're going to be sorted. If gender matters at all, gender doesn't always matter. Like I tell people to look through all the different forms that you have students filling out in a million different ways. And some of these forms include gender for essentially no reason. Like if you're going for an appointment at Career Services and you're filling out a form for an appointment schedule, does it include gender on there? There's really no reason for it to. Why would it? And so and you'll often find that especially older forms have gender on them really for literally no reason. And so part of the question becomes is there actually a reason for asking people's gender? If you are, you want to make it really clear that you are asking for gender identity in which, and you are going to respect and sort people based on their identity and not by their gender and not by their biological sex at birth. Go back over. And so we've already talked about, a number of different parts of campus that might, and people who might be involved in terms of helping and supporting transgender students. Some common things that you'll see are training for faculty and staff, information, published and made clear and made available to students about rights and resources, having explicit policies relating to non-discrimination based on gender identity, and really basically having safe and easy access to anything that cisgender students have access to. Transgender students need access to it as well. And so that includes, bathrooms, it includes, gyms, it includes sports, it includes, it includes healthcare. If you offer healthcare, it includes everything. Anything that cisgender students have access to, trans people should have access to as well. I'm going to actually, I don't mind sharing this PowerPoint with you along with the PDFs that I planned on sharing. So I'm going to drop some things in. In the Zoom, I believe that I can share documents through here, and so I'm going to try that. But I kind of realizing that we only have maybe about 10 minutes left. Is that right? Are we down to about 10 minutes here?
Yeah, but we're allowed to go longer if necessary.
Okay.
Also, if you'd like to drop me your slide deck, I can publish that as well. Yeah,
I'll definitely do that. I'll send you. How about I send you by email the slideshow and the different documents that I've been using and bringing up, and then you can share from there. But I think that I really want to make sure that I take the time to get questions from people, and realizing that even if we can go over, and I don't mind staying longer, but I know that your own schedules, you may have things to do after 1 p.m. I'm not sure. So, or after, 1 p.m. for you guys. I got it right. I got the time change right. So I want to kind of get toward the end of this, but basically the big steps are making sure that facilities are open access to people of all identities, making sure that students have the ability to self-identify and that they can find easy ways of doing that. This includes I don't know what online learning system you use, if you use Blackboard or Desire to Learn, but making sure that students are able to change their name in that, so that when they show up, if a professor reads off all of their, reads off the names off the roster, that they're not reading an older name that a person might not want to identify by or might not answer to anymore. And training basically for faculty on how to handle things within their specific area. So these are the big first steps that people can make. Ultimately, what I really like saying with this is that, this can sound like a lot, depending on, I don't know anything right now about what your campus is like, or what you already have available, or what accommodations you already make, or how you already set yourselves up. But I realize that if you haven't done a lot of these things, it can seem like a big task. Like it can seem like a lot of different areas of college life to explore and to work with and to try to, adapt in order to support this population. But what I really encourage people to do is see this not as a chore, not as a list of tasks, but really as an opportunity. Because like I said earlier, you're dealing with a population that may not be supported at home, that may not have been supported by their high schools, that might not be supported by their families. And one of the biggest things that you can do, I'm sure you all know the research in terms of boosting retention and boosting student success, is that students stick around if they form a connection to your university. They will be there if they form an emotional connection, if they feel personally involved and invested in the community of your college. And part of that, like an enormous sort of inroad to that, is if you have a population of students who feel accepted at your university, maybe even more than they feel accepted at home. It's huge. And so I want you to see this as an opportunity to retain students and an opportunity to better students' experience at your college. So I'm going to kind of like leave myself off there because I definitely wanted at least 10 minutes for people who may need to leave, if you need to leave, to ask any questions that you might have. So I'm going to cut myself off, even though I could talk for a long time, and see, is there anything, I guess, that came up during my talk so far that you are curious about, or anything I moved through too quickly that you want to hear more about, or anything confusing?
So I'm going to jump in because
Sure.
I do have a time and endpoint. You were very, what do I say? You stepped out there and you spoke to the individual when you move back into the educational context as
Right.
right. And that's a big step, and students may not be ready to make that step with
Yeah.
an instructor or an advisor who, so are there ways that we can, I don't know, represent ourselves as being more open to having those kind of conversations so that we so that we just sort of make it, I don't know, make people feel like they are able to have those conversations with us?
Sure. Well, I think that it depends. So it depends a lot on what your role is, like, within the university. Like, and I'm sure that this would be, say, different for, a advisor versus a someone on the janitorial staff versus someone versus a professor versus a campus secretary. So what I would try to look for is, in whatever role you have, try to see in what ways you can make a public show of support. Like that might be as simple as, if you have an office, put up a sign on your door that says, like, this is a safe space, like, or this is a place where, I'm an ally, you can talk to me. Like, if you are teaching faculty, I'm sure you have some kind of statement of non-discrimination in your syllabus. You can take the time to highlight that really specifically and to make sure that gender identity is in it. And to make sure that you can do little things like, I guess I just mentioned a few minutes ago, the class roster thing. Like, I don't know, instead of on the first day of the semester, like reading out a list of names on a printout, instead, ask people to introduce themselves. Ask people to, like, I make a game sometimes out of the pronouns thing, just because I do want to know people's preferred pronouns, but sometimes it can seem awkward to be like, what are your name and what are your pronouns? And so instead, I'm an English teacher, so my sneaky way is I ask people for all their parts of speech. I ask people for their name, their pronouns. I ask people for their adjectives, for their verbs, and their adverbs. And it's it's goofy, but it makes people think in a funny way about, like, and it slips the pronouns thing in there. Be creative, I guess, but basically find a way to, to publicly, like, make yourself known as an ally. I think is really the answer there. And highlight the non-discrimination policy and the gender identity is in it. And yeah, I guess that's the simplest, the broadest way that I can think to put it.
Yeah,
Because you're
thank you.
right, it is. Yeah. Does that make sense? I hope that's enough.
Yeah,
of an
and
answer.
I'm a professor, so
Yeah.
it completely makes sense to kind of check on all those things along the way.
Yeah.
So thank you.
And it's stuff you only think about over time. Like, I mean, even though, I am a trans person, and I transitioned long before I started doing the whole, like, just tell me your name and give me your stuff, like, kind of thing. Like, I used to be the reading off the roster person, like, because I don't know, it was what everybody did, and so I did it. But it took me a while to realize, well, at the college that I was teaching at the time, students had no way of changing what their names were in Blackboard. Students had no way of changing what their names were in, like, in the other, I can't remember what it was called, but the other student system that lists out our our class rosters. And so probably at various times, without even realizing it, I said a name that someone no longer goes by. And so trying to think through, thinking through, like, giving people the space. I think that in some ways you're kind of lucky, because this generation of trans people are more likely to come out earlier. Like, if you were to graph it over the last, like, 50 to 75 years, the average age of a person's transition has gradually gone down and down and down. And it's simply a matter of cultural awareness. Like, students who are coming in at 18 and 19 years old have grown up with the internet, and they've grown up with trans celebrities in all of their programming, and so they are more likely to identify themselves earlier than I did. So at least you kind of have that going for you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions?
Hi, I'm Katie. I work with facilities. And I have a question, if we could go back to the restroom situation. So I'm also an architect. And so there are, state laws we need to follow. But in your personal opinion, I was at a college recently that it was a new building. And instead of putting in a men's room, a women's room, and an all gender restroom, they just went with all single user restrooms and labeled them all gender, all of them. In your opinion, is that a better approach than having, again, men's, women's, and all gender? Or what is your thought process on that?
So, well, it's an interesting question. So I would say that I'm trying to think of this also from the, like, if I try to put myself in the position of an architect or designer, I'm sure part of what I'd be thinking about is how many people are going to be using these facilities at once. And I think that in some ways, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have, like, to have men's room, multi-person men's rooms and multi-person women's rooms. I think having non-gendered, inclusive restrooms is valuable in any space. I think the most important thing would be to have a campus policy that is very clear and unmistakable that a person should be using the restroom with which they identify. Like, I think as long as you have a clearly stated and public policy that is, that's unmistakable, that a person who identifies as a woman should be using the women's room, and a person who identifies as a man should be using the men's room, regardless of biological sex, I think that you're in pretty good shape. And that's often what we have to do if we have older buildings, and every university has older buildings, right? I mean, there's only, and to some extent, when we design newer buildings, sure, if it's a building that where you think that maybe we won't have, where it's not like a sports stadium or something, where we won't have a flood of people going to the bathroom at the same time, maybe you could have a very comfortable situation with just several, like, or a few different single occupant, inclusive restrooms. Sure, that could be great. But I think that in situations where you need to, either because of the age of the building or because of just, logistics, if you need to have, multi-person men's rooms and multi-person women's rooms, this goes for locker rooms and things like that too, then as long as you have a policy of inclusion that says, you use that with which you identify, I think you're in pretty good shape. Does that answer the question? Or...
It does. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else?
I just want to throw one in there, and this is not on buildings or colleges for that matter, but
Okay.
you said your dad was very supportive of you after your mom had passed. Was there anything that they could have done for you at a younger age? I mean, did they, I
Oh
don't want to say
gosh,
suspect kind of thing, but that's sort of what I'm asking. Is
it's
there any way they could have
no,
made your
oh
life better?
gosh. You know, I think being I would say that who my parents were and the way they were is not what prevented me from coming out for so long. It was that I thought for a long time, as in my grade school years, I thought I was literally the only person who felt this way. And trans people tend to be more aware than most of how gender is constructed socially. We're aware of the things going on around us, and and children are regularly, they feel the shame if they aren't fitting their gender correctly. I'm not saying that shame came from my parents or my family. If anything, actually, my parents and family were extremely open to any way that I wanted to be. My home life was excellent as a child. It simply took me that long to come out because of the culture that we were living in and the culture that I grew up in. In terms of like, are there things that my parents might have noticed? Nothing that I would have expected them to at the time. I mean, basically the things that I did get really interested in were fairly gender neutral in a lot of ways. In that, I liked writing and I liked video games and I liked, and I liked running around and climbing trees and doing gymnastics and things like that. I mean, I don't know, are these typical like boy things or girl things? I would never want parents to too quickly fixate on any gendered behavior as evidence of anything. I would say simply, having an attentive and close relationship with your child, which my parents did. It was more the culture that I was living in that prevented me from coming out for so long. It was not anything really specifically that my parents should have done differently. If anything, although I shouldn't, if anything, I kind of blame myself for waiting so long. I wish I hadn't waited so long. Because when I did come out to my dad, he told me, the only things that he ever really wanted me to be were he wanted me to be, he had his 4 words. He wanted me to be kind and brave and honest and happy. That was all he said. And so what he said is that by coming out and by transitioning, he felt like I was being more all of those things and not less any of those things. And so I guess, you just want to be supportive. You just want to be attentive. You want to listen to what your kids say. And the trouble for me is that the culture that I was living in was one in which I felt unable to say the things that I wanted to say. So really, I like to think I'm an optimistic person, and I like to think that I think our culture is actually shifting and changing for the better in a lot of ways. And I think that we're now more likely to have children, identifying themselves because because they're simply aware. And I realize that it's precisely that effect of media awareness that leads to a person coming out earlier. It's precisely that effect that makes anti-trans people say that that kids are going crazy these days and they're being influenced by all of these things in the media. But you can, it's funny that we're having this talk. There was just a John Oliver about this that I'm like flashing back to now. I don't know if anyone watches Last Week Tonight, but this was literally just the topic like last Sunday. And he pointed out, I think a really significant thing, which is that you could say the same thing about left-handedness, that there was a certain point around the 1940s or 1950s when the number of people who would put down in a form that they are left-handed skyrocketed. It was not because there were suddenly more left-handed people, but it was suddenly because teachers stopped whacking kids with rulers for writing with their left hand. It's as simple as when the environment is more hospitable, we will make ourselves known. And, to some extent, you can do that as a person, as a parent, as a family member, but in part, it's a matter of the culture and the world that we're living in as well. And that has an effect no matter how much we wish that we could create these perfect worlds for our kids to grow up exactly as we'd like them to. We're aware that the culture that we're living in has an effect. I do like to think that despite all the battles that we're currently still fighting, I think that our culture is improving and is getting better. And so I think you're more likely to have people come out at a young age.
Thank you. I think that's a great sentiment from your father and from you that
Thanks.
gives me hope for the future as well.
Me too.
It's been wonderful listening to you.
Thank you. Is there any? I have plenty of time, but is there? I understand some people may need to go, but if there is anything else anyone wants to talk about, so I see Lynn is saying thank you for sharing. Oh, Well, good. Thank you. I'm glad it was helpful. I hope this was a good experience for everybody.
Yeah.
Is there any other last minute stuff that anybody wants to ask about, or should we get on with our days, I suppose?
You can feel free to put it
All
in
right,
the
then.
chat if anyone
Okay.
wants to put something.
Sure,
in.
that too. Yeah. Thank you guys. I really appreciate you coming and listening.